we will just wait about 1 more minute. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on Casual Conversations. Casual Conversations started last fall in the publication of the Brain Injury Professional magazine, and we started a Zoom show to interview people in the brain injury field in a casual format for people who are staying home on COVID to get to interact with other people. And it has grown. I think this is our 22nd show, so I really appreciate everybody showing up tonight or today, wherever you're calling in from. And I just wanted to share my screen for a second. Today we're talking to the National Center for PTSD Stress, Post-Traumatic Stress and Disorder Brain Bank. They are one of 4 brain banks that PINK Concussion recruits women and men to donate their brain, to pledge to donate their brain. And so the 4 would be the National PTSD Brain Bank, the Charles Tater's Toronto General Hospital, the brain bank there, and then Kristen Dams O'Connor, the Brain Injury Research Center at Mount Sinai, and then my dear friend Willie Stewart at the Glasgow Brain Bank. And that is for the UK and Northern Ireland. If you are interested in pledging your brain, you can go on the PINK Concussions website under Pink Brain Pledge, and it has more discussion about questions about that. So anyone that pledges has a choice of those 4 brain banks. Today, we're going to talk to 2 people from the National Center for PTSD, which is where we started our brain bank when we did a collaboration with the VA in January 2018. So welcome, Kendall, and welcome, Olivia, to the show.
Thank you, Catherine. We're both excited to be here. We are going to talk about some things that we discussed in our annual meeting throughout our National PTSD Brain Bank that was last month. So we're happy to share everything with you and glad you invited us.
Well, thank you. Well, before we start with the update on the brain bank, I did want to give each one of you a chance to introduce yourselves and tell us how you ended up where you are today at the brain bank. Olivia, would you like to share about your journey?
Yeah, of course. So hi, everyone. I'm Olivia, or Liv. You can call me Liv. I graduated with my master's in neuroscience back in 2018 from Trinity College in Connecticut. So when I was there, that was when I first got started kind of in the world of brain injury and of PTSD. I worked on a research project there that was devoted to looking at survivors of domestic violence and whether or not they had sustained any sort of traumatic brain injury as a result of that violence. So it wasn't a project I went looking for. It kind of fell into my lap. There was an opening in a research lab that was definitely interesting to me. And I was lucky enough to be able to be on that project for about 3 years. So what we did in that project was we administered batteries of cognitive, mood, and PTSD assessments to women who had survived domestic violence or any sort of intimate partner violence. More often than not, these are women who were in some sort of shelter situation when we were speaking with them. So we administered these batteries as well as the brain injury screening tool, and then used the research that we had gained to be able to refer to necessary services either in neuropsychology or neurology for those women who were affected by brain injury and the symptoms of such. So started on that project. Like I said, we had done that for about 3 years. I was able to do the research both here in Connecticut and when I traveled abroad to the Caribbean. So saw those comparisons across different groups of people, which was very interesting. So when I left that project, I moved into sort of a clinical setting in a hospital and found out I didn't like that and wanted to be back into the world of research, which brought me back to the brain bank here at the VA. So I've been here for almost 1.5 years with the VA Brain Bank and have been lucky enough to work with Kendall for about 1 year now. We worked together on the project about PTSD, which we're going to tell you more about, pretty heavily focused on PTSD, but also TBI. So I really wanted to get back into the research world just because I felt like the clinical setting wasn't for me, but also the research world is something where knowledge is being gained and knowledge is being accumulated and kind of disseminated to other people. So got back into it. That's where I plan on heading eventually. Hopefully going to grad school for a clinical psychology PhD in the near future, not too near. But yeah, so that's kind of how I got into brain injury with the project and research, and have still been working through that with more specifically a veteran population, but also a non-veteran population here at the VA. And it's been a great past year, hoping to be here for a few more years and find out some interesting things and continue to work with Kendall and the rest of our team. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And Kendall, if you want to introduce yourself too.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us on. My name's Kendall. So like Olivia said, we've been working together for almost the past year. So I will be here, it'll be my 1 year mark next month. But a little bit about me, I went to Wesleyan University and I got my BA there, and I was a double major in neuroscience and psychology. And then I also stuck around and got my master's degree in psychology from Wesleyan as well. So I graduated last year in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. And like Liv, I'm really interested in research. My master's was focused in developmental psychology, so completely different side of things, more the beginning side of life and development, which is super interesting. And I was looking at how children were able to use landmarks to find out where they were. So very different than what we're doing now. But while at Wesleyan, I was a two-sport athlete and have suffered a number of concussions throughout my lifetime. And so with that, and paired with my major in neuroscience, I was very interested on the sports-related side of concussions and TBIs. And then when I was presented with this opportunity to work with veterans and PTSD and TBI, I couldn't pass it up. Again, something I'm really interested in is the brain, how it works, behavior, all of those things. And so this brain bank kind of combined everything together. And Liv and I have done it's been a really good year with everything that we've been doing. And we're excited to talk a little bit more about what we've been up to for the past year.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction, and it's great to have young faces, young voices, and have you start, put your enthusiasm into this project. And it was very important to me in the years leading up to the launch of Pink Brain Pledge to try to find brain banks that were specifically interested in women, and not only signing women up, but that had funding if those brains should become available to actually look at that brain. And that's an issue because there is a cost to having to procuring a brain and then preparing it and getting it ready to study. And I didn't want to recruit for a project that didn't have the funding to carry through with the research. I also wanted to pick brain banks that you signed up under an IRB, internal review board. You signed up and you were a part of that research from that moment. And that, maybe the person signing up had 40, 50, 60 more years to live, but that they would be included in the ongoing research. So the brain banks that we chose to work with all met that criteria. So that the first one was the PTSD Brain Bank. And it was important to me because I also wanted to look at the trauma aspect for women who suffered IPV or domestic violence, so that the PTSD was also being looked at with the TBI, a PTSD without TBI, TBI without PTSD. So that's while I first started talking to Matt about coming on with the brain bank. So we started in January 2018, and it is a hard process. There's paperwork to sign, and it's not particularly easy. And I was warned that you can go to a room of 100 people, and no one in that room will have donated their brain. You can talk about it, and maybe you'll get one person. So it is slow going, but we are excited that we are now in our 18, 19, 20, 21, fourth year of recruiting. So with that intro, I'd like to hand it back to you, Olivia, to talk about the program for some people that is new to them, and for an update on what has been accomplished.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Catherine. So like Catherine said, we're going to be going through a few different things, a little bit about the productivity of the brain bank, because of course the goal of the brain bank is to be able to gather this knowledge, gather tissue and the knowledge that goes with it, and then to disseminate that to people interested in research like ourselves. But we also do want to talk about a little bit more about where we've been in the past year, specifically how our collaboration with PINK Concussions has helped to increase the representation of females in the research world, which we didn't see so much before in our project anyway. So with that, I'll get started. We're going to be talking about some things that we discussed, like I said, in our annual meeting last year. So again, the overarching purpose of our brain bank is to disseminate this knowledge that we gather. So we've had a total of 14 or so publications come out of the PTSD Brain Bank here at the VA, 3 in the past year or so. These continue to be kind of solidified with presentations and abstracts about that research. Similar numbers there. We've had about 13 presentations or abstracts at different types of annual meetings. These have mostly been virtual in the past year, of course, because of everything that's been going on. But we have had 2 new presentations and abstracts come out of our brain bank since the last year. Like Catherine said, we're funded pretty consistently by different sources. We have a lot of people that we work with and collaborate with on both.
Paxton Smith has had to turn off her phone's ringer and notifications.
Wow, she is a powerful speaker. Go
This
for
past
it.
weekend, the Lake Highlands High School valedictorian
This is so moving. She's
made
such
a last-second change to her speech at
I don't-
graduation.
And I thought that the microphone was going to get cut off.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So like Catherine said, pretty consistent sources of funding just through our different collaborations and the different researchers that we work with. But more importantly, of course, we distribute brain tissue to those who are interested in studying PTSD, TBI, and other related disorders. So we've distributed tissue to about 7 different researchers at different sites, such as McLean Hospital, Camp Institute, and things of that sort. We have about 8 researchers who have requested to gain tissue through our protocol. That process can be long and drawn out just because of the regulations that come through an IRB related study. So we have about 8 researchers who have contacted us saying that they're interested in looking at tissue through the PTSD Brain Bank, and we will eventually be distributing tissue to those people as well in order to further their research. But just to get a little bit more into kind of our tissue inventory versus our ante-mortem enrollment. So we'll talk about 2 different things today. Our inventory consisting of those who have already enrolled in our study and donated to the brain bank, and then our ante-mortem enrollees. So our current inventory for tissue is just about at 300 right now. The numbers I pulled were from a few weeks back when we were preparing for this annual meeting, but I believe we're at 296 people who have donated brain tissue to the brain bank. This is, being the PTSD Brain Bank, this is mostly a PTSD sample, about 38% PTSD. About a third of those are control tissues, which are very important donors in order to make comparisons. So 33% of those self-identified or were diagnosed as controls going through medical screening. Pretty high depression sample there, about 26% of ours, of our inventory sample was diagnosed with depression.
Olivia,
And then, yep.
Olivia, just to jump in, a control, somebody that was serving as a control participant, they would not have had any PTSD nor any TBI?
Exactly. So our controls are people who have self-identified or through different screening tools, if they came in through our veteran sample and we looked through their medical records, who weren't diagnosed with any sort of PTSD, depression, TBI, anything like that. So those are pretty certain pure controls on our end, that they have no existing diagnoses of anything like PTSD or TBI.
That's great, because sometimes I do have women that want to pledge and they don't have either and want to know if they still can be, like they have a family member. So that's great to know that literally anybody can pledge.
Yeah, of course. No, anyone can pledge to our brain bank. Again, reason being those comparisons are so important. A lot of the researchers that we work with in our brain bank specifically will look at differences between those with TBI and PTSD versus those without either, or versus those who have just TBI versus TBI and PTSD. So those comparisons are really important to the research. So anyone with kind of any sort of gamut of those is able to pledge their brain to research here at the VA.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, of course. So then just to kind of go into the demographics of our cohort, and Kendall will talk a little bit more about this and how PINK Concussions has really helped out here. So we are currently mostly a male sample in terms of our inventory, but those numbers have started to even out with our PINK Concussions collaboration. So our inventory is currently about 68% male, 77% Caucasian. Our most productive year in terms of our tissue inventory was 2018, when we had 73 people donate their brains to the PTSD Brain Bank, and our second most productive year was 2016, when we had 58 donations. So it varies. It varies because there are some people who would rather donate to or enroll in the ante-mortem part and be able to be followed across life, rather than those who come in as post-mortem donations with no sort of workup on our end. But again, people can enroll on both ends of that if they've been enrolled for years and years, or if very close to their passing, they decide that they want to donate their brain tissue. So recently, one of the things that has become of a lot of interest in terms of our brain bank is secondary diagnoses for our inventory. Reason being, most people that come in don't always just have one pure diagnosis. It's not always PTSD or it's not always TBI. One of the things that we saw quite often was either substance or alcohol abuse. So of the 290 who have donated to the brain bank, 254 of those have some sort of secondary diagnosis, so aren't just coming in with one diagnosis listed. Mostly substance and alcohol abuse, but also some with depression, a handful with anxiety, a handful with bipolar or ADHD or ADD. And then when we look at things like depression, these are including any sort of depression diagnosis, either major depressive disorder or any other unspecified depression, and similar in terms of anxiety, or any type of panic disorder related to that. Then to the military breakdown of our tissue inventory, our veteran sample is lower in our tissue inventory, so we actually have more non-veterans who have already donated their brain than we do have veterans. Our tissue inventory is 26% veteran. That's mostly either Vietnam sample or those who served in Operation Enduring Freedom or Operation Iraqi Freedom. And we mostly have an Army sample, a little bit further behind that is Marine Corps, and then a handful each from the Air Force, National Guard, and Navy. So again, a little bit less of a percentage in terms of veterans with our inventory population. So recruitment is really what we're interested in talking about today. We recruit through a few different ways. We have our VA website, which I think has already been included in the email that was sent out. But if not, we'd be more than happy to direct anyone there. If you search VA Brain Bank, we should be the first ones that come up. We collaborate with a few different brain banks. So we have an ALS and a Gulf War brain bank, but us specifically, we are the PTSD Brain Bank. We recruit through a few different ways. Local events, which have again been a little bit less because of COVID in the past year. But these are things like lobby events here at the VA, television, radio, or social media interviews. And another big source of enrollment for us is those who co-enroll in our other brain banks. So like I said here, under the umbrella of the Veterans VA Biorepository Brain Bank, we have PTSD, ALS, and Gulf War. So about 16% or more, if you look at both of them, closer to 20% of our participants are co-enrolled in our other brain banks. And then, of course, our referrals from PINK Concussions, which when I'll get to in a little bit, you'll see has really just increased our enrollment quite a bit. We collaborate with the Seattle Vietnam Era Twin Registry out of Seattle, VA. And we are working to start up a collaboration with the Armed Forces Retirement Home. So that should be somewhere down the line. So we enroll through a few different ways. These can be through sending out permission to contact forms to people who said they might have been interested. We then contact them by either telephone or mail to ask if they are still interested in participating. We're now approved to do email our consent through RMS encryption, which makes it a lot easier in the digital age in order to get these things in quickly. And we're also approved to use fax to be able
So
to consent people.
I want to make sure I understand that. So it is now, you can now sign up virtually. You don't need to do all the pieces of paper?
So you still do need to do all the pieces of paper, but what we can do now is email them instead of just mailing them. So one of our holdups used to be that as mail is, it's slow, it can get lost, things like that. So we can now email those forms out to you. They do still have to be filled out by hand, but then you can then scan and fax them back to us or scan and email them back to us. We are working towards totally online consenting as a regulated study hasn't been approved yet. But we are working on it just because we know that a lot of people that we've consented into the study have expressed interest in being able to do everything all online.
That's awesome. And you are joining a research project. And so there are a number of pieces of paper to fill out. And that is one of the barriers to getting people to sign up. So the fact that those PDFs can be emailed and then done and emailed back, that's a huge jump. So I'm very excited for that.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely helps out. Some people prefer the mail, but we have a lot of people who request it by email, just knowing that it'll come in faster and they can return it faster. So, but like you said, that has been one of the challenges, is just actually sending them out and getting them back. Another of our challenges that we tend to face is the subject matter of brain donation in itself. This can be a difficult thing to talk about with family members or even with the person who's interested in donating their brain. It can feel kind of far away and kind of different for people. So that's something that we'll often talk to families about as one is enrolling in the brain bank, just to make sure that they really are interested and they know what they're signing up for. More often than not, when someone has reached out to us, they are interested in brain donation. But it's one of those things that can be difficult to talk about, and it can be a difficult subject. So that is definitely a challenge to our enrollment portion. And then, like you said,
one thing
go ahead, Sarah.
One thing I do find when I talk about brain donation is people will say to me, well, I've already signed up with my driver's license. I've already done that. And to explain that even if you do organ donation for your state and it's on your driver's license, that does not include your brain. And this is an additional process by which you pledge your brain to a specific research project and you sign up to be a participant in that project.
Exactly, yeah. So brain donation is separate from organ donation. We have a lot of people who choose to do both and will let us know when they enroll with our study that they'd also like to donate either their organs or their body to a separate science organization. But like you said, ours is specifically brain donation for research relating to PTSD, TBI, and things of that sort. Just to talk a little bit more kind of about the distribution of our current cohort. When I say current cohort, I mean people who are currently enrolled in the study and have pledged to eventually donate their brain to the PTSD Brain Bank. We have enrollees from almost every state in the United States, minus 8 of them. We are most highly enrolled from Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, and New York. And since last year, we've enrolled our first participants from 5 different states. So we're definitely moving up the ladder in terms of kind of covering the entire United States. Something else that we looked at when we looked at all of our geographic distributions was how that geographic distribution differed by sex. And because, again, of our collaboration with PINK Concussions, we have really only about 5 or 6 states that are enrolled with male only. All the others have both female and male, and some of them are solely female from those states. Since last year, we've enrolled our first female participants from 4 different states. So again, moving up the ladder in terms of the span of who's enrolled, and as well as increasing our numbers of women enrolled in the Brain Bank. So currently, just to kind of let you see or let you know how we've grown over the past year or so, last year we had 135 people who were enrolled in the Brain Bank. We are now at 175. So in the past year, we've had 40 people enroll in the Brain Bank. We've had a few new donations, people who have actually passed away and donated their brain tissue. And those numbers stay pretty consistent. They've definitely been increasing over the years. They tend to be a little bit more productive in the past few years. But our enrollment numbers again have really skyrocketed in terms of PINK concussions. Our most productive year was last year, was 2020, but our second most productive year was 2018 when that collaboration with PINK Concussions started in January of that year. So we had 36 people enroll in that year. But looking specifically at PINK Concussions, we have 31 of our currently 175 people enrolled are referrals from PINK Concussions. This, in terms of split up by diagnosis, this is a pretty heavily PTSD sample with a few having primary diagnosed depression, some with anxiety, and some who were still working to get their baseline surveys back and find out what they would self-report as a diagnosis. We've been collaborating with the Vietnam-era Twin Registry, like I said, and they are our second biggest source of enrollment, but all the way down to 15. So PINK Concussions continues to be the leading source of people who want to enroll in the brain bank and actually fill out those forms and go through with the process and remain enrolled. So I'm going to hand it over to Kendall to talk a little bit more about what our baseline process and then our annual follow-up process is with our enrolled participants.
So after officially enrolling in our study, we get started with some paperwork. We send out a 15-page baseline questionnaire, more for us to get an understanding of demographics, any uniform service experience, combat history, chemical exposure, health status, medical history, concussion and TBI history, as well as tobacco and alcohol use. And with that form, we also send out another one. It's called the Primary Care Evaluation of Mental Disorders Health Questionnaire, which assesses depression, anxiety, binge and restrictive eating, alcohol abuse, stress, and menstruation. So those go out first. And then when we receive those back, our next set of assessments are over the phone. And these are done with a clinician. It's about a 2-hour or so assessment with a clinician that goes over current and lifetime PTSD symptoms and the severity of those symptoms. So that would be the longest part of our study, is that 2-hour phone call. And then after that, within the first 6 months of enrollment, we send out the second set of forms, which is a PTSD checklist that assesses PTSD symptoms based off of what you believe is off the past month, and then what you believe to be your worst month with PTSD symptomology. And then we receive those back, and then Liv and I will give you a call to do our baseline assessments. And together we have 3 assessments that we do here. And together those don't take more than about 30 to 45 minutes on the phone. But again, we found some participants like to split them up and do 3 shorter phone calls, or just like to get them done all in one phone call. But we have 3 assessments. The first one we start off with is called, it's a telephone interview for cognitive functioning. So it screens measures assessing attention, memory, and language. And then the next one that we go over is a neuropsych interview, which it's an abbreviated version used to assess depression symptoms, panic symptoms, alcohol and substance use symptoms. And then lastly, we do an alcohol and substance use screening, which will just assess lifetime and past 3-month use of alcohol or substances. So after all of that is done, you're officially done with the baseline assessments. And from then on out, we follow up with our participants on a yearly basis, that we talk to them on a yearly basis. Behind the scenes, Liv and I follow up on about a 6-month basis. With our veteran population, we're able to access medical records just to make sure that everything is up to date, or if we need to know of anything. And then on an annual basis, we give our participants a phone call, and we follow up with 2 phone surveys. 2 of them that I had just mentioned, we do the telephone for cognitive functioning, as well as to assess, the second one is the alcohol and substance use screening, just to see if anything has changed over the past year. And then we also send out via mail or email, we send out a follow-up survey, which is a very much abbreviated version to the baseline survey, that just asks any questions about any sort of change in demographics, military service status, health status, medical, healthcare use, tobacco and alcohol use, as well as that PTSD checklist, again, what your past month worst symptomology and what you believe to be your past month and your worst month. So those are the 4 things that we follow up with on an annual basis. And like I mentioned before, Liv and I also look on a 6-month basis just to make sure there are no new changes in mental health or hospitalizations, head trauma, anything like that. We try to make a note of in our files. And then another source of information that we use are next of kin interviews. So in our inventory, so after one of our participants pass away, we usually do an interview with the next of kin who the family had designated. We had someone sign for that as well, just to go over certain things about more within the past 3 months or so before their passing, just to see if anything had changed. But now just to move into some of our cohort demographics, the majority of our population is 50 plus, with our highest number in 60 to 69 year age range. And again, to break it down by gender and race, our population is predominantly a white male population, but we've seen that with our PINK Concussions collaboration, we've seen our female population grow a lot, and we're hoping to see those numbers grow even more in this next year. And we're seeing and then going forward, all of this data, going forward is from our baseline information, but from that packet that we send out to our participants. So looking here, out of our 154 that we have received back, about over 55% have had a bachelor's degree or higher, and most of them we see our veteran population coming from the Army and Navy, and most of them served during the Vietnam and the Gulf War. And some interesting percentages that we have found, about 45% of those with PTSD were Army vets, 17% were Navy vets, and 11% were Marine vets. And then we also saw that about 41% of those with PTSD served during the Vietnam era. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Liv just to talk a little bit more about our self-reported mental health diagnoses.
So yeah, just to go a little bit more into our antemortem cohort, like Kendall has been discussing, and to discuss a little bit more about what our cohort is self-reporting on their baseline survey. So that's the 15-page baseline survey that people are sent initially when they enroll in the Brain Bank. We send that immediately after they enroll, just to get some more information on military history, mental health diagnoses, and things like that. Being the PTSD Brain Bank, our most highly reported diagnosis on this baseline survey was PTSD, with 71% of our enrollees self-reporting PTSD at some point in their life, even if they're not currently experiencing that. 68% reporting depression, 57% reporting anxiety, and 14% reporting bipolar disorder. One of the interesting things that we did see between those who had reported PTSD versus those who did not, 52% of those who were in combat reported PTSD on their baseline survey, whereas only 28% of those who were not in combat self-reported PTSD. So we saw that difference pretty heavily when looking at our veteran sample and how combat exposure was affecting PTSD diagnosis. We also discussed here when we were looking at some of our data, again, those secondary diagnoses. And we had a pretty high rate of people who were reporting more than one diagnosis on this self-report measure. So out of those who reported PTSD, which was about 71%, about 110 of our participants, 76% of them also reported depression. So we saw those occurring at really high rates. And then similar numbers for anxiety, about 64% of those who reported PTSD also reported anxiety. And then a little bit lower, 54% actually reported all three, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. We then have about 31% who reported anxiety and depression without PTSD. But again, being the PTSD Brain Bank and recruiting with the populations that we recruit from, we saw pretty high percentages of PTSD and related disorders there. Other disorders that we saw here were bipolar disorder. About 13% reported both PTSD and bipolar disorder. Lower numbers in terms of bipolar and schizophrenia comorbidly, but bipolar disorder was another one of those ones that we saw pretty highly. So to kind of move into neurological issues as opposed to mental health issues, our cohort really highly reported memory loss as a result of either PTSD or TBI. So about 26% of our cohort, so over a fourth of them, did report having some sort of memory loss at some point in their life. Other reported diagnoses there were epilepsy, stroke, and dementia. But again, the memory loss seemed to come really highly correlated with PTSD here. So 31% of those who self-reported PTSD also reported memory loss, whereas only 16% of those who did not report PTSD reported having some sort of memory loss. So the memory loss diagnosis and the self-report was coming along pretty highly with the PTSD diagnosis. Other self-reported issues that we saw quite a bit were sleep issues. Sleep issues were really common in the cohort that we're working with. 34% of those in our population reported having sleep apnea. 34% reported having insomnia, and then lower numbers in terms of TIA, Parkinson's, or ALS also. ALS mainly coming from our collaboration with the ALS Brain Bank. And again, seeing the difference between those who had reported PTSD and those who did not. Of those who self-reported PTSD, 42% reported also having insomnia, whereas of those who did not report PTSD, only 15% reported insomnia. So both memory loss and insomnia were things that we saw at really high rates among our PTSD population in the Brain Bank. Something else that we looked at in the Brain Bank, which we're definitely interested in talking about here, was sports and concussion history. So about 41% of our cohort had played some sort of sport in their life, at least one. And then we had lower numbers of those who played more than one, but still about 16% had played 2, 9% had played 3, and then one who had played 4 sports in their life. Most highly reported was football with about 25%, but we also had pretty high numbers of those who played soccer, hockey, and boxing, as well as judo in our cohort. So one of the most interesting findings from, one of the most interesting findings from when we looked at our data was that 87% of those who were in our population actually also reported having some sort of TBI in their life, whether this be in childhood, whether this be more than one. Up to 87% of them reported having one TBI. We expected those numbers to be high, but I'm unsure if we expected it to be that high. 34% of them reported having some sort of blast trauma exposure. So similar head injuries, but presents differently, and of course, resulting from different injuries. And then looking a little bit deeper into those concussions, the total number of concussions reported in lifetime was, the mean number was 13.7. 3.4 of those came along with a loss of consciousness. So high numbers of concussions, high rates of people who are experiencing TBI as a result of either combat, of domestic violence, or anything of the sort that can cause a TBI. So then, of course, being the PTSD Brain Bank, we looked a lot at PTSD assessments and how these were viewed in our cohort and how our cohort performed on these measures. So we did what was called the Clinician Administered PTSD scale with any of our participants who were able to do this over the phone and who were able to finish about an hour and a half to 2 hour phone assessment. This goes into a lot of depth on trauma exposure, how often trauma exposure had happened, and exactly what the exposures were. So of the 118 people who had taken this Clinician Administered PTSD scale, or the CAPS assessment, 113 of them reported having some sort of traumatic exposure. This was mostly a military sample, being through the VA, but also pretty high numbers in terms of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and domestic violence. So about 95% of them reported having some sort of traumatic event exposure. 65% of those who had a traumatic exposure met criteria for having PTSD in what they labeled as their worst month. 30% of them reported having PTSD currently, or met criteria for PTSD currently. We also send out, on top of the CAPS assessment, a PCL5, which looks at PTSD symptoms at baseline and then annually to see how they're progressing, if at all. The cutoff score for the PCL5 for having PTSD is about a 31 to 33 based on the National Center for PTSD Research. In the worst month, the average score for our participants was 51, which is well over threshold for having PTSD. In the past month, it was 34, which is just a little bit over that cutoff for having PTSD, that cutoff score of 31 to 33. But in both past month and worst month, our cohort was definitely experiencing PTSD at high rates and affecting them throughout the lifespan. So I am going to hand it back to Kendall to talk a little bit more about our cognitive and other measures.
Sure, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about our scoring for our cognitive assessments. For that cognition assessment, that assesses attention, memory, and language. Our score is out of 50. And we've seen, we've completed our baseline TICS score. Sorry, we've completed our baseline TICS with 126 of our participants, and the mean score is about a 35.7. And so we, to put that in context, anything below a 25, we review with our team to look over, as well as check medical records to see if there's any changes in their cognitive functioning that we should be aware of. And then for our mini, which assesses MDD, panic, substance use, and alcohol use disorder, we've had about 45% of our participants have met for past MDD, and about 76% of those who have self-reported PTSD have also met criteria for past depression on the mini, and 19% of those who did not report PTSD also met criteria for past depression. And then moving into our assist, which is our alcohol and substance use screening. Almost all of our participants have used alcohol at one point in their life. The majority, the top 3 substances that we've found to be used were alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. Where about 77% of our populations use tobacco across their lifetime, and about 68.6% has used cannabis across their lifetime. Currently, we've seen that almost half of our population still drinks alcohol, but our numbers for tobacco and cannabis use have dropped off. About 17% still use tobacco, and about 14% still use cannabis. The other substances that we look at include amphetamines, hallucinogens, cocaine, sedatives, opioids, and inhalants, just so you can get an idea of the things that we're looking at. And Liv, if you want to hop back on for our longitudinal follow-ups.
Yeah, so just kind of getting to sum everything up here, just so everyone kind of has an idea of where the brain bank has gone and how it has changed over time here. So like Kendall has been talking about before, we follow up with our participants annually. We do our best to follow up within about a month or so mark of when they had completed their baseline process with us. This can vary. Working with human participants, of course, people have things going on. Their first priority isn't always answering our questions on the phone. But we try our best to keep this within about 1 month of when their baseline process was completed for our annual. A large portion of our participants still are in the baseline process, given the fact that we've had such high enrollment rates in the past year. So I'd say probably about 50% of our people are still kind of working through their baseline process. But we have had 72 of our participants complete 1 annual follow-up, 52 having completed 2 follow-ups, 28 with a 3rd, 27 with a 4th. And we've actually had 4 people complete a 5-year follow-up. So those were some of our initial people to enroll in the brain bank and who have remained enrolled and who we've been following since then. So just to kind of summarize what Kendall and I have been talking about here, again, we are right now and working to balance those numbers out, primarily a male Caucasian Army sample. 84% veteran. And again, those numbers have started to even out, especially given our collaboration with PINK Concussions. But that's something that we've been working to even out just because the prevalence of having females in research terms is important to us, of course, and important to organizations like PINK Concussions, and that's exactly why we do the research that we're doing here. Our mean age was 60 years old, a well-educated sample, 95% having more than a high school education, pretty high combat veterans with high self-reported combat exposure on our end, 96% having met criteria for having a Criterion A event or a traumatic event on the Clinician Administered PTSD scale. And then just looking at the differences between self-reported mental health disorders and their clinical assessments, 65% of our participants met criteria for lifetime PTSD, and 71% reported lifetime PTSD on the self-report questionnaire. So pretty similar numbers there. The difference starts to lie when we look at current PTSD. So only 30% met for current PTSD on our CAPS assessment, whereas 65% reported having current PTSD by self-report questionnaire. We saw similar numbers with depression. 21% met criteria for depression on the mini, like Kendall said, whereas 60% self-reported having current depression on our baseline questionnaire. And then just to look at our PCL scores, which again talks about PTSD symptomology in both the past and worst month. Score was over threshold on average in the past month and well over threshold for worst month. And then just to touch back on what Catherine had said, about 11% of our population self-identified as controlled on a self-report questionnaire. So that's where our cohort has been. We're working on a few different things right now. Really happy to be able to be in touch with Catherine and learn about what she's been doing here with PINK Concussions. We're hoping to kind of start up some more recruitment here and again work to even out those numbers of females in research. We're also working to finalize recruitment collaborations with the Armed Forces Retirement Home down in Washington, D.C. We've been discussing collaborations with the Alzheimer's Association in order to look at how PTSD and Alzheimer's looks both in a clinical sample and neuropathologically. And then, of course, the overarching goal of the Brain Bank is to publish data. We have all this research or all this data here. We've been working with our Tissue Access Committee in order to be able to distribute all that knowledge, because, of course, that is the goal of the Brain Bank, to publish research on this and to be able to reach investigators who are interested in similar things. So that is all Kendall and I have for you guys. I appreciate everyone who joined in to listen today. Thank you. If you have questions, I think that I can put our name and number in the chat if anyone does want to contact us. But again, I appreciate you having us on today. We're really happy to be a part of this. And again, PINK Concussions has been such a great source of recruitment for us, and we're happy to be able to continue that collaboration with them. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Kendall. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question of the group, and I'll go back through the chat and look at some of the questions. I did want to say, I mean, the one thing that I've learned in the 5 years of talking about recruitment is that I think most people aren't asked ever to donate their brain. And I think I was talking to Professor Hoff, Dr. Hoff, from Mount Sinai, and he was saying, it was brain donation is kind of considered in the icky department. It isn't like you're donating an organ and that part is going to go into another human being, and it's a sense of you're donating something to go into a petri dish, and it doesn't have the same emotional connection, I think, as humans, that we want to give our body parts to other humans so that they can go on. But that really, once people are asked and start to think about it and realize they don't need their brain once they pass away, and the value of it. So, I mean, I from walking around the Senate and congressional offices in DC, I asked all the legislators I went to for their brains. I mean, I'm kind of, when they ask, well, what can I do? I'm like, can you donate your brain? So I'm always talking about it. And it's slow to get people to do it. One, because there's some paperwork, and also it's a mental leap. So are there other things that you've seen in recruitment that you found interesting, or how to break down some of those barriers?
I think that and I don't know if Kendall wants to jump in also, but I think that the main thing that we see is just the idea, like you said, of brain donation itself. When breaking down those barriers, I think the thing that tends to kind of sway people a little bit more is that at the end of the day, it is the person who is affected by these things who wants to donate their brain. So we'll talk to a lot of people who are like, you know, I might be interested in donating my brain, but I haven't talked to my family about it, and I know it's something that they might kind of be on the fence about. But what happens a lot is when we touch base with people again in a few weeks or after having sent them some more information, what tends to be the general idea is that them talking to their family about how they've been affected by either TBI or PTSD or something of the sort throughout their life, how much it has affected them and how much they either want to contribute to the research, how much they don't want this or any other people to have to go through this, and how this specific donation is able to kind of help along that path. That seems to be kind of the swaying factor with a lot of people. Again, like you said, brain donation in itself is kind of difficult to talk about, and it's difficult when you first think about it. But it is exactly how we look at treatments, how we look at how it affects people. So it's an important part of the research, and I think that when people kind of break it down, it's something that they want to change. It becomes a little bit easier to talk about.
Yeah,
I would agree. Oh,
go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, I agree with Liv and what she was saying. I also think that the other thing that we've come across is the actual donation process and how there can be loopholes to jump through. And I think the main concern people have asked me about is like an open casket and being able to still have that be a possibility, which it is. And that's something that we definitely reiterate to our participants, is that it's not noticeable from the front. And so I think that also helps a lot of our participants decide to enroll as well. And I think that helps the families as well.
Is there any cost to families if someone wanted to donate?
No, so there's no cost. We completely cover the cost of the donation. Another question that we get is if we cover costs of funeral and cremation services, which we do not cover those costs, but we cover any costs of transporting to have the donation completed and then bringing back to the funeral home. Anything that involves the donation process we cover, but that's it.
And again, I think it's one of those things that the first time you discuss it, it's a little awkward. And now I'm like, hey, want to give me your brain? Like, I literally just go for it. And I think that it's important because when I first started looking at this, I was calling around to brain banks around the country, and they maybe had 2 or 3 female brains, and it just wasn't, it was hard enough at that point to solicit male brains. Now, that's not true when you look, I think, on the Alzheimer's brain banks, where women are so primarily affected by Alzheimer's. So it's the TBI, and I think we just haven't made the connection with the number of women with domestic violence and IPV that are out there that, in time, I think as that narrative makes more of a connection, maybe we will have more female donations. But it's great to hear the good news that the work that all of us are doing to promote this cause is resulting in more people connecting. Any other questions?
I have a question. Do people ask, or do you tell them what type of research exactly, like what are the research projects that they're going to be involved or their brain will be used for? I think maybe giving that sort of what's the mission or the specific goal of the research project may encourage, or I don't know, maybe more interested if it's something they're connected to or something like that. Like, is it just like donating brain? I mean, there could be any type of research involved.
Yeah, so sometimes that does get difficult just because we don't know necessarily with our tissue access committee who's going to request tissue and who's going to want to, what project specifically. But what we do is send out an annual newsletter to our participants who are enrolled just letting them know if there has been any research or publications that's come out of the brain bank. And all that research is public knowledge. You know, you can go on Google and find it, and it tells you about some of the different things that what brain bank tissue has been used for. We do talk to a lot of people when we kind of follow up with them during our annual calls, who will ask us anything new, have you guys found anything, anything that would be interesting to me, and we always refer them to, like we said, our publications and things like that. There's no way to tell at the inception when someone enrolls what exactly their specific tissue will be used for, but we can tell them kind of overarchingly like what specific project this is going towards, and let them know about some of the things that have already come out of the brain bank.
Okay, thank you. I'm seeing in the chat box a couple questions. One is that Lisa Kurth, she asked if any of these brain banks accept infant child brains for future research on perinatal brain injury.
Yeah, so our brain bank does not specifically. One has to be over the age of 18, as well as the other ones in the VA. Catherine, I don't know if you know any more about the other brain banks through the Pink Brain Pledge, but ours specifically is over the age of 18.
I'll check with Kristen and Mount Sinai, but I don't think that there's an age. I'll just text her right now. Good
And
question.
follow up to that, Lisa also asked if there's any statistics in this sample on incidence and prevalence of neuroendocrine disruption.
Yeah, so I did see that. Sorry, Lisa, I meant to respond to everyone, but I think I only responded to you. We don't currently look at any sort of neuroendocrine disruption. I think it would be a really interesting thing to look at, especially with the amount of people that we have enrolled, but currently we don't look at that.
And Deneen, last question I see is any connection to the Latinx community and Black and Brown communities for future research?
Specifically right now, no, but I think that again would be something that we should start touching upon, especially we started to work up our numbers of females, but as you saw from both our currently enrolled as well as our inventory, we're primarily a Caucasian sample, which of course is not representative of the population. So I think it's definitely something that, you know, if the opportunity arises, that is something that we should start working towards in the same way that we started working with Catherine towards increasing the amount of females who are currently enrolled.
That's awesome. And we will be promoting the Pink Brain Pledge at the IBIA virtual conference where PinkX will be presenting on 3 days. We have the first day on domestic violence and brain injury and women in the prison system and the connections. The second day is going to be on sex and gender differences in TBI, and the third day will be systemic barriers to Black women with lived experience and Black professionals in brain injury. So it should be a really exciting 3 days, and at each one of those junctures, each one of those sessions, we will be talking about brain donation and how important it is. So thank you, Kendall and Olivia, for your really hard work, and it's great to see such enthusiastic people on this project, and I'm sure that both of you have made a big difference, in your work this year and in your work with years with the VA. So look forward to connecting with you as you move on. Any last question before we go? I think Lisa Love. Just have to unmic.
Okay, there we go.
You got it.
So I was wondering, do you have any like a flyer that possibly be able to put in like a portfolio in a waiting room for clients that would explain the brain bank and the need for donations? Do you have any flyer that you would be able to email?
Yeah, of course. So we have both a flyer and a brochure that explain. The flyer is a little bit less descriptive and kind of more generally give us a call if this is something you're interested in, and we'll tell you about it. We also do have a brochure that explains a little bit more about why exactly brain donation is important, who is able to donate their brain, and things like that. So I think Kendall just put our emails in the chat box. If anyone does want to reach out to Kendall or I, it's just our first name dot last name at va.gov. We'd be happy to send out any sort of our recruitment materials. That is something that we do pretty often, is put these in waiting areas, either in places like neurology, places where people who are affected by PTSD and TBI would be exposed to it. So yeah, we can definitely send those along to you if you reach out to us, and we'll get them right to you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you,
thank you.
everybody, for attending today. Thank you, Kendall. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for our staff who help us so much at IBIA. Thank you, everybody, and stay safe, and we will see you next week. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.